Today, we're really digging into something fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's this surprising link between having a dog when you're a baby and how it might affect the chances of developing persistent wheeze, especially for kids who already have a sort of genetic tendency towards asthma.
Right, that's the key. We're looking at a study, a really interesting one from the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology, published back in February 2023.
Okay.
And it basically tackles how this, very common thing, having a dog early on, might actually interact with specific bits of our DNA related to breathing problems.
Mm. So potentially some unexpected news for people worried about asthma risks?
Could be. It certainly offers a different angle to think about.
All right, so let's unpack this. The study used information from what, 5 different groups of kids born in the UK?
That's right, 5 UK-based birth cohorts. And the crucial part is the kind of data they had.
Which was?
Well, they had genetic information, actual genotypes, for thousands of these kids. And alongside that, really detailed info on whether they had pets, specifically dogs or cats, right from infancy.
Wow, okay. That combination sounds powerful.
Exactly. It lets you really start to probe those connections between, nature and nurture, our genes, and our early environment.
So why this specific focus? What was the gap they were trying to fill?
Well, the background is that genetic studies, like genome-wide association studies, they found lots of genes linked to asthma. But
It's just not the full picture.
not even close. Those known genes just don't explain all the heritability we see. Something else has to be going on.
Like gene-environment interactions.
Precisely. And when it comes to pets and asthma, previous research has been, frankly, all over the map. Some studies say pets protect, others say they increase risk. Many find nothing conclusive.
Right, I've heard that. It's confusing.
It is. So these researchers wanted a more focused approach, looking at a specific known genetic risk factor.
And that specific factor. Tell us about the gene or the genetic marker they looked at.
Okay, so they zoomed in on a particular spot on chromosome 17. It's known as the 17q1221 locus. And within that region, they focused on one tiny variation in the DNA code.
SNP.
Yep, a single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP, called RS2305480. Think of it like one letter change in a massive instruction book.
Okay.
Now, this specific SNP, RS2305480, one version of it, the G allele, has already been pretty strongly linked to a higher chance of persistent wheeze.
How much higher?
The study quotes an odds ratio about 1.37 for that G allele. So yeah, about a 37% increase in the odds of persistent wheeze if you carry it compared to those who don't.
Okay, 37% increased odds. That feels like a noticeable bump in risk. So how did they actually test if having a dog changed anything for these kids with the G allele?
Right. This is where the method gets clever. They analyzed data from just over 9,000 children where they had both the pet info from infancy and the genetic data for this SNP. And they didn't just look at wheeze, yes, no. They used something called latent class analysis.
Okay, what's that do?
It's basically a statistical way to group kids based on patterns of wheezing over time. Like, did it start early and stay? Did it pop up later? Did it come and go? More nuanced than just a simple yes, no.
Got it. So different types of wheezers.
Exactly. Then they used statistical models, multinomial logistic regression, to see how having the G allele and having a dog or a cat interacted to influence which wheezing group a child fell into.
And they combined results across all 5 groups.
Yes, they did a meta-analysis. That pulls all the data together from the 5 cohorts, which makes the findings much more robust. You're not just relying on one group. You're seeing if the pattern holds up across different populations.
Okay, makes sense. So the big reveal, what did they find about dogs and this specific genetic risk? This is the really interesting part you said.
It absolutely is. They found a significant gene-environment interaction, specifically between that RS2305480 SNP and owning a dog.
And what was the interaction?
Here's the kicker. For the infants who did have dogs at home, that G allele, the risky one,
Yeah.
it was no longer associated with an increased risk of persistent wheeze.
Wait, really? No longer associated at all.
Essentially, yes. The adjusted odds ratio they calculated for dog owners with the G allele was about 0.95, which statistically is basically saying there's no increased risk compared to those without the G allele if they had a dog.
Wow, that's quite something. So having a dog seemed to almost, cancel out the genetic risk factor.
That's what the data strongly suggests. It appeared to neutralize that specific genetic predisposition for persistent wheeze in this group.
And how did that compare to kids without pets?
Big difference. In the kids without any pets, the G allele behaved as expected, was clearly linked to a higher risk. The odds ratio there was about 1.61.
So about 61% increased odds in the no pet group with the risk gene.
That's right. So the presence of the dog seems to be the modifying factor here.
Okay, so dogs seemed protective in this specific genetic context.
Yeah.
What about cats? Any similar effect there?
Interestingly, no. The study was quite clear on this point. They didn't find a similar protective effect or interaction with cat ownership.
Huh.
Yeah, having a cat in the house during infancy didn't seem to change that link between the G allele and the increased risk of persistent wheeze.
That is interesting. Why dogs but not cats, I wonder?
Well, the study doesn't really explain the why, but it clearly points to something specific about the dog exposure. It wasn't just any pet exposure.
Okay, so let's try and sum this up. We have this specific gene variant, the G allele of RS2305480, linked to higher odds of persistent wheeze.
Correct.
But if infants with that risk variant grew up with a dog,
That increased risk seemed to disappear.
whereas cats didn't show that effect.
Exactly. So the main conclusion is that dog ownership in infancy seems protective against persistent wheeze, maybe even asthma later on, but specifically for these genetically susceptible individuals carrying the 17q1221 risk allele.
It really drives home that point about genes not being destiny, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It shows how our early environment can potentially reshape the outcomes associated with our genetic blueprint. That interplay is key.
So the million-dollar question, how? What might be happening? Did they speculate on the mechanism behind this dog effect?
That's what everyone wants to know, right? The study suggests broadly that it's about early life environmental exposures triggered by the dog, but they don't pin down the exact biological pathway.
So theories, but no firm answers from this paper.
Right. Could it be changes to the infant's gut microbiome, the bacteria living inside us? Dogs definitely bring in different microbes.
Maybe. Or different allergens, different immune system stimulation.
Those are definitely possibilities, different types of exposures, different timing, maybe different immune responses being trained early on. But yeah, this study didn't isolate the specific mechanism. That needs more research.
And other details like, does it matter when in infancy the dog arrives? Or even the breed of the dog?
Good questions. The study looked at ownership during infancy as a general period, so it doesn't break down specific timing within that first year or so.
Okay.
And no, they didn't have data split by dog breed either. So we can't say from this work if, a poodle is different from a Labrador in this context. More things for future studies to potentially look into.
Okay. So wrapping this up for everyone listening, the really standout finding is this quite unexpected idea. Having a dog around very early in life might actually counterbalance a known genetic risk for wheezing problems in certain kids.
That's the core message. It's a powerful example, really, of how genes and environment aren't separate tracks. They're constantly interacting to shape our health.
It definitely makes you think, if early dog exposure can have this kind of effect, what other everyday things from our early lives might be interacting with our genes in significant ways we just haven't discovered yet?
Yeah, it opens up a huge area for consideration, doesn't it? How much of our long-term health is being subtly shaped by these early gene-environment conversations that are happening all the time?
A lot to ponder there. Well, thanks for walking us through this fascinating piece of research. Truly thought-provoking.